So welcome back everybody from the break. Thank you very much for the discussion that you just did, and I'll hand over to Faye Ward, Chief Responsible Investment Officer at Brunel Pension Plan, in achieving net zero and asset owner view. Faye, over to you.
Thank you, Andreas, and thank you very much for inviting me to share the work that Brunel has been doing with the net zero zone. I think it's quite an exciting idea. I certainly look forward, if we can have more digital conferences and less travelling, definitely appeals to me, and it will certainly help my own carbon footprint. I've got a few slides, only a very short presentation, and I'm happy to take quite a lot of question and answers to dig into details that people are more interested in. What we've said here is sort of achieving net zero and asset owner view, and I think we've sort of, through today's presentations, we've seen kind of how individual companies and how that can be using the taxonomy perhaps to aggregate up, and certainly when you get to the sort of asset owner level, it gets increasingly complicated to actually answer the question, are you achieving net zero? So I think we are seeing increasing number of investors, including ourselves, make that commitment, but the commitment is an awful lot easier than knowing the how. And to be fair, and I'll be honest up front, not to disappoint people too much, but I don't have any, I have all the answers. I do have a few ideas of steps that we're trying to take to go in the right direction. It's definitely a journey, and I think we're making progress and understanding a bit more what net zero actually means for us. Brunel Pension Partnership is one of the asset pools for local government pension schemes here in the UK. So we undertake the implementation of their investment strategies. We've got 10 underlying clients, including the Environment Agency Pension Fund, which is where I came from prior to joining Brunel. And those organisations all control their own strategic asset allocation. They all set their own investment strategy and are ultimately responsible for paying those pensions. And our job is to go away and to deliver that in the most effective and high-performing way that we can. But all of those clients had aspirations to want to tackle climate change. They'd all been subject to both internally actually seeing it as a genuine risk, but also had been subject to quite a lot of stakeholder pressure through various sort of pressure groups to take more action, and that was very much the stimulus behind our work to bring that together and to work with all of those 10 asset owners to come to a consensus view. So it's a project that we've been doing over a while. So we had worked with our clients, and we had established a climate position statement back in 2019 in May, which very much summed up kind of where we were at and what we were doing. We're doing things like carbon footprints and doing engagements, but what we felt we needed is a more holistic approach, and also recognising the fact we wanted it to be what was the direction of travel, where did we want to go. And what we identified was that for Brunel, particularly its place in the investment chain, we really needed to see systemic change in the investment industry if we were to bring around our ambition to be able to invest and support our clients in their net zero ambitions. And that would require us to take action on a number of fronts. We've sort of distilled this into 5 areas around sort of the policy objectives, around the product availability, around how we manage individual portfolios and the asset manager relationships, some of the positive impacts, some of the positive capital allocation, and then persuasion, engagement with companies about changing behaviours and practices and disclosure at their level. So there's all of these different elements that we needed to do to bring about some of those changes that we wanted to see. So what I've tried to do is summarise in one slide some of the practical steps don't want to see my disclaimer, not just yet. Some of the practical steps as an asset owner that might be worth sharing in terms of what we're looking at to move towards that net zero. I think the first important thing, just taking a step back from the detail, is the fact that we've joined forces with a number of investors with the IIGCC, the Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change, in a project called the Paris Aligned Project. And that's its objective is to actually to identify what does a below 2 degrees, or essentially a net zero commitment, actually look like at a pension fund or investor asset manager level. How do you ascertain whether you are doing enough across all of your asset allocation, and it is quite tricky. So some of the practical steps we're taking in the meantime, before perhaps we have some more of those answers across our portfolios, One is that we identified that there are quite a few kind of policy barriers around that, obviously the price on carbon, fossil fuel subsidies, and some of the ways as an FCA regulated entity we have some quite short-term risk measures that perhaps focus the minds of investors in a different place where they need to be when trying to achieve a net zero commitment. The regulator in the UK has identified the fact that it has a role to play in this and is still sort of considering kind of the steps it's taking to do that, and currently has a consultation. The FCA currently has a consultation out on what would be the reporting requirements that issuers should have in relation to climate risk that might assist some of this sort of risk measurement going forward. And then there's a sort of attribution analysis. So once when you've got your sort of looking at your portfolio construction, we use things like carbon footprints. We also use them in combination with the Transition Pathway Initiative. And that allows us to see where companies are at, which ones are contributing the most within portfolios to that carbon intensity. But using TPI in those pathways to have that forward look, particularly on carbon performance, to see which ones have set themselves those forward-looking targets that will bring them on a net zero pathway. So we feel as if that starts to give us more information about sort of the allocations within portfolios and where particular conversations with managers in terms of the investment case around those particular holdings, or indeed engagement opportunities either with the asset through the asset manager or directly ourselves through our service provider. So a lot of that analysis can also assist on stress testing that we can do to start looking at more long-term how these portfolios might stack up under different scenarios. At the moment, we're drawing very heavily on the Bank of England work that they've produced on the insurance for the insurance industry to conduct some of those stress testing. A target which I know that Andreas is particularly pleased with is the fact that we also set and took some of the work that the EU work have been doing on the benchmarks, and although it's not an absolute target, it's a step in the right direction, which was to set a 7% reduction per annum against the standard benchmark. So the step one was just to try to reduce the carbon intensity of our portfolios every year by a 7% against that standard benchmark. So some of our portfolios, because of the work we did in manager selection, are already well below sort of 7%. Some of them are 20 or 30% below already. But it's about that. But that's not all portfolios. And some asset areas, it's easier to do that than others. And depending on the breadth of the index, the standard index in which you're setting them, so more those indexes, so smaller cap or indexes like the FTSE 350, when you narrow the range and the other investment parameters, it can be harder to meet some of those 7% reduction targets. So the first step is just to try and reduce it against the standard benchmark. The second step we're looking at is actually questioning the benchmarks that we're using. What benchmark do we actually need for achieving a net zero? What are the right metrics that need to compile that? I think there's a general understanding that sort of a market-weighted index is probably not going to take us where we need to get to. So thinking much more fundamentally about what we need. And this is particularly relevant then if you're running sort of index or passive products against those requirements. There's the positive allocation, so actually looking at kind of where we can allocate, particularly perhaps in our private markets and our private equity and infrastructure portfolios. We've made some pretty sizable chunks of money into renewable infrastructure and will continue to do so. And also using things like the EU taxonomy to then analyse all of our portfolios to see what contribution that we're making across the different asset classes. We're seeing that as a very useful tool. We are still trying to get our heads around it, and I did welcome very much the presentation today, and I will try and read that through again to see how we can create or analyse our portfolio. There's engaging. I think that's nothing new there. We put there with teeth because we will escalate and focus. People may be aware that Brunel co-filed a shareholder resolution at Barclays. We've issued some press release today and commentary within the Financial Times, Moral Money, and encouraging asset, or certainly declaring that ourselves we will be voting for both shareholder resolutions, which is a very unusual step taken by Barclays to actually produce a counter climate resolution on their AGM agenda for next Thursday. So be interested to see how that work goes, but very much engaging and making it very clear what our expectation as owners of these assets are and what we want to see in terms of emission reductions over the long term. And this one also, I say engagement with teeth, and is also linked to this climate stocktake, which is linked to, we anticipate that there will be the sort of biggest stocktake happening as part of the sort of the COP processes that go on and the work of the UNFCCC. And what we seek to do there is to actually review everything that we've set ourselves in terms of our policy and to see what has worked, what has not, what managers have been able to integrate climate risk and are working effectively, which have not, what stocks on what individual companies and how have they performed, and which ones are on the right journey and which ones are not, and then to take some pretty tough decisions there in autumn 2022 as to kind of what our next steps will be. And we have reserved the right at that point, we said, to that although we don't want divestment, we think that that is probably the point at which we'll identify if there are individual companies or asset managers for which that's just not viable for us to move forward if we're to achieve this net zero ambition. So that very much summarises some of the sort of practical steps I would share with you. Whether they're enough to reach net zero, we don't know yet, but that's very much part and parcel of sort of working with yourselves, working with other investors in a lot of these collaborative forums to identify just what does that look like when you aggregate it up across multiple asset classes and when you've got quite a complicated sort of structure, and to see what the final answer is, because I think we all share that ambition to want to get there. So that's from me. So that was just a very rapid overview. I have posted both the presentation and our full policy on the LinkedIn group for you to sink your teeth into more detail, and I'm open very much to your questions after you've heard Andreas's presentation. So over to you, Andreas.
Thank you very much, Faith. Highly appreciate it. I'll give you an applause. Everybody is very welcome to post questions as said on the screen. I will now take over the screen. Faith, we also did manage to understand the miracle of the sound. Apparently, when you hit space inadvertently, it mutes automatically. We didn't know that. We will next time inform everybody up front. But I think it worked pretty well. So now everybody should see my screen. Christian, Faith, could you briefly confirm? One of you that it works?
Yes, I can see your screen, Andreas.
Yep. Okay, so I will present climate transition investing, and I will focus on the nature of climate transition investing as being absolutely sustainable versus the relatively more sustainable low carbon investing as we knew it from 2019. So absolutely sustainable is focused on net zero and is focused on improving year on year. I have the absolute pleasure that I can use the actual delegated act, at least in its draft form, of the European Commission in this, so I can very much show you that the text words are more or less exactly taken over by the Commission into the draft form. I should also very much thank all my tech colleagues and others that have helped in advising this scientific work. So generally speaking, we know that there is a strong ambition to become net zero by the European Commission. Ifigenia spoke about it earlier. The Commission itself had it in November 2018. All the member states, with the unfortunate exception of Poland, agreed to it in December 2012. And the first Europe-wide climate law was proposed just over months ago by the Commission to basically put net zero 2050 into actual law, so make it a legal mandatory effect. Then we have seen funds getting out of fossil fuels. So for instance, Ireland became the first country in the world to divest fossil fuels, the first sovereign wealth fund in the world to divest fossil fuels in July 2018. The European Parliament declared a climate emergency as well, and we need to move forward. And as Yuri Orgelli, the IPCC's 1.5 degree lead author, as pretty clearly, we basically don't have a choice here. We're like in a frog in a water glass that's gradually heating, as I argued in one of my IPE pieces. Essentially, if we do not reduce emissions and move on an absolutely sustainable path of investing, we will even miss the 4-degree target. So to stay within the 4-degree target, which would be a pretty uncomfortable world with maybe a lot of lockdowns, a lot of crisis, we have to be net climate neutral by 2100. To reach the 1.5-degree target, we have to be net climate neutral by 2050, shortly thereafter. So in essence, we have no choice but to gradually get to climate neutrality. You can think about it as a diet. Imagine me, you've seen me briefly at the beginning of the presentation, not weighing about 90 kg, but weighing 280 instead. If I would be at that weight, I would be speaking like this, I would be sitting everywhere, I would have a life-threatening obesity, and I would know that I couldn't actually do a diet to get to normal levels, say below 100 kg, within 1 year. It'd be completely impossible to do that. So I know that I would have to multi-year diet, and I know that I have to make a disciplined plan. And the most important thing, and many of you may have had experience with diets in terms of calories, is to have discipline. You can have a great plan, but if you don't have discipline, the plan itself doesn't actually help. And for instance, if you make a diet resolution on New Year's Eve, but you permit yourself to eat all the chocolates that you already bought from the supermarket, then that's equivalent to permitting yourself overshoot in a climate scenario. So it's very important that we gradually get on a greenhouse gas diet, and that asset owners like Brunel Pension Plan and others make reduction targets. And the reduction target of the TEG is -7% year-on-year for everybody that's starting now. If you'd seen the UN emissions gap report, they have -7.6%. And so this number, 7%, 7.6, of course, if time passes, it might grow to 8%. If the planet doesn't react, that number will continue to be around, because that's the right speed of the diet, if you want. So it's not too slow, but it's also not so super fast that it maybe shocks the economy. And how would a diet look? So here's a trajectory going from about 42 gigatons of CO2 per year down to 0. This is for simplicity shown in CO2 rather than CO2 equivalent, but it's essentially the same thing if you take greenhouse gas emissions. And so then what are the key objectives of these climate benchmarks? And now that we have the actual legal document, which I'm showing you here, we can nicely phrase this. So the first aspect, and I'm very proud that we can say this because it wasn't at all clear this time last year, is that we focus on the 1.5-degree scenario with no or limited overshoot, exactly as the IPCC recommends it. So there is no softening down of ambition. We then also very clearly in the legislative text say that the Commission's objective is to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So that's the important aspects in the objective. And the second important one is that things should improve year after year. So there should be a constant improvement. And that might sound like a small feature, but compared to low carbon investing as it currently happens, that is a huge feature. Because low carbon investing as it currently happens is X% better than benchmark, but isn't necessarily better than it was itself last year. So if the benchmark increases emissions that it kind of did 2017, 2018, and you're 20% lower than benchmark, then yes, you are lower, but you're still increasing emissions. So you're no way on the, you're in no meaningful way moving towards net zero. And in that sense, you're not actually tackling climate change mitigation. You may be feeling a little bit better than otherwise, but you're not really looking at mitigation. So simplifying this, and academics are not always good with simple charts, but I hope this one is simple, and I posted on LinkedIn, and I very much look forward to everyone's feedback, how I can make it simpler or even better. So absolutely sustainable investing is equal, if you want so, to reducing greenhouse gas emissions versus the market benchmark. That is where low carbon investing currently stands. It's relatively more sustainable. Then the next thing we need is reduce greenhouse gas emissions year on year by at least 7%. So actually being on a downward trajectory. And that is hugely different to what is practiced. Then we need to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. That's the first three aspects of being an absolutely sustainable investor. There's two more, as you can see. I explain them throughout my presentation step by step. So what does it technically then mean to reduce emissions 7% year on year? What are the European Union requirements for this? So we have two indexes here, the Paris Aligned Benchmark and the Climate Transition Benchmark. The Delegated Act has made this pretty elegant. So now any type of exclusion, is it fossil fuels, is it electricity produced above 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour? Is it even tobacco? Any exclusions with the Paris line benchmark? The climate transition benchmark is the one that doesn't prescribe exclusions, so that being the main difference. We follow the IPCC's 1.5 degree scenario with no or limited overshoot. We are starting from a good decarbonization position, so the climate transition benchmark starts at -30%, the Paris line benchmark starts at -50%. This is for listed assets, for firms with listed equity based on greenhouse gas intensity. For firms without listed equity, this is based on absolute greenhouse gas emissions. Absolute greenhouse gas emissions is exactly what the IPCC, for instance, uses. So countries need to make commitments in absolute greenhouse gas emissions. They can't make commitments in greenhouse gas intensity. Otherwise, you can have some African country, for instance, saying, I'm going to reduce my emissions per GDP, but then if the GDP grows a lot, the emissions actually are not really reducing in reality. We also have an inflation adjustment here that ensures that a 7% greenhouse gas intensity reduction is at least a 7% absolute emissions reduction. So this is very much an absolute reduction. The Paris line benchmark starts at -50. Climate transition benchmark starts at -30. Conceptually speaking, you can think about this. If I had started 10 years ago to reduce 7% year on year, I would be at -50 pretty much. If I had started 5 years ago to use 7% year on year, I would be at -30. So then the self-decarbonization is -7%, very much as Brunel and others are now also endorsing. Then we have in the equities and allocation constraint to tackle any type of greenwashing, which means you can't just move all your equity investments from heavy sectors into light sectors. And then we do have the exclusions, in particular on any firm with more than 1% revenue from oil, more than 1% revenue from coal, more than 10% revenue from oil, or more than 50% revenue from natural gas or electricity produced above 100 grams of CO2. These particular exclusions only apply to the Paris line benchmark. They don't apply to the climate transition benchmark. So it's a relatively structured and I would say easy to understand and easy to teach setup. Coming to the second key objective, and that's also a significant change from where the industry stood, and that, for instance, has led to some debates with selected index providers which seemingly don't feel ready to do this. So we're essentially very clearly saying in the European Union legislation that scope 1 and 2 only could lead to counterintuitive results. And I personally have heard this at conferences, I think for years to this stage, where people very rightfully say, if you do scope 1 and 2 only, oil and gas looks actually pretty good. But if climate change was a disease like cancer, the cause of all of this is oil and gas. And in particular, it's oil and gas scope 3. I've discussed this with IPCC scientists and they fully agree. There are greenhouse gas emissions that are unrelated to the coal, oil and gas sector. This will be, for instance, cement or farming, but they are clearly the minority. The majority of emission is effectively scope 3 fossil fuel emissions. And so scope 3 fossil fuel emissions do have to be considered in the climate transition investing proposals from the very first year. And then after 2 years, we phase in industrial emissions. And after 4 years, we're phasing in any emission out there, including financial services, for instance. And if you've seen Eugenia's presentation earlier, it was quite visible that utility companies are actually good at setting net zero targets. Energy companies are proportional to their market cap, but industrial companies are heavily underproportional. So it seems that industrial companies do not get enough attention from active engagement and are currently not moving as much as they could, hiding potentially in being a heavy industry company, but not energy or utilities or basic materials. So then here is the focus. Scope 3 has to be included from day one. And so the fourth aspect of absolutely sustainable investing is scope 3 has to be in. And technically speaking, we basically say, okay, we have to consider life cycle analysis. We have NACE codes. As we earlier discussed with Nadia here, we have to use NACE codes because of European Union legislation. Codes 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 19, and 20 are in from day one. Others are added after 2 years, and everyone is in after 4 years. If you find double counting issue, a recommendation is to just separate scope 1 from 2 and 3 and do 7% reductions on the footprinting scope 1 and the benchmarking 2 and 3. But if you don't have a double counting issue, you can also just, of course, add everything together on scope 1, 2, and 3. And then the third key aspect is slightly hidden, but I like to point this out, because when we talk about scope 3, everybody immediately says, Andreas, but the data is terrible. And yes, the data is terrible, but we're not going to solve climate change by waiting for companies to disclose pollution. Because as an academic, I can freely say it, companies on average have a huge disadvantage, to be honest, about bad things such as pollution. There's a financial conflict of interest. Many people don't necessarily present themselves to new friends showing their worst side. And unfortunately, the average company isn't actually good. We're seeing companies that are very good about it. You saw, for instance, Shell and Repsol, Shell's disclosures, Repsol's commitments, but the average company doesn't really have an incentive. The leaders have an incentive, the laggards certainly not, and the ones in the middle is also structure. So we essentially can't wait for companies to disclose, which means that we actually have to estimate. So, and we very clearly say this here, the emissions of missing, unreported or underreported greenhouse gas emissions have to be estimated. Principally meaning the vast majority of emission numbers have to be estimated. And that is a little bit of a burden, but that's the only way that investors can take initiative. If investors will wait for companies to disclose and then wait for disclosure to be audited and then wait for it to be accurate, it's simply way too slow for the net zero commitment. We can estimate these, and the beauty is we can estimate them, as the Commission very clearly writes in the proposal, based on precautionary principles, which means that whenever you're in doubt, the estimation should be larger than the real number you think the company has. And this is absolutely important. Why? Because if your estimation figure is lower than the number the company is actually having, you're providing a disincentive for the company to disclose. Only when you're looking at the company as worse than it really is, disclosure means the company can present itself better. So estimating based on the precaution principle and including quite heavy penalties for non-reporters and including reasonable penalties for underreporters is the only way this works. We can't wait for those companies that are laggards or those companies that just can't be bothered to actually report the data. It will have to be estimated in the same way that many other corporate information nowadays is estimated based on key performance indicators. And so essentially the fifth step to absolutely sustainable investing, and that's effectively 4 steps further than the relatively more sustainable investing as we know it, is to include the precautionary principle in the estimation of greenhouse gas data. And these 5 steps really are an investment approach that have very good chances to get the asset owners that follow this and the asset managers that follow this to net zero by 2050, in some cases potentially earlier. That depends on treatments of offsets. Why is this so important? We're involved in another initiative with Imperial College London and several others, Climate Disclosure 100, when we asked companies if they were happy to be actually endorsed to have reported 100% of the greenhouse gas emissions. That's also based on Bloomberg's excellent work on the data indicator ES074. We're coming to less than 2% of the market cap actually reporting complete, which means that more than 98% of the companies are either non-reporting, underreporting, or having other challenges. So estimation is simply a required part of this. And we'll have to have a debate about it, but clearly the guidance for it is follow the precautionary principle, which means if in doubt, err on the side of the planet, not on the side of the company. That's the only way we can actually get to net zero. I hope that was educational. I'm certainly, or interesting in many ways. I'm certainly very happy to follow up with anybody on LinkedIn. Please do feel free, just post questions below or send me direct messages, whatever you prefer. Thank you very much. And Faisal and me are looking forward to your questions, and love to learn from questions and comments. And there's no such thing as a stupid question.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for the great talk. You gave applause for the others, so I'll also now give applause to you. Thank you very much. And also Faith, thank you very much for the trajectory deep dive that we just had here as part of the Net Zero Zone digital conference. So we have already some first questions in the chat. Please continue asking questions so that we can keep the discussion going. Andreas, maybe you can already pick up questions from the chat and answer directly.
Sure, I can pick up questions from the chat straight away, no problem. So I'll start with Bernd's question. Why was it decided to exclude controversial weapons from the CTB but not the PAB? That has been a move that was in the delegated act, so I can't give you the exact answer. I believe the simple answer is probably that exclusions are controversial, so the easiest way to get all member states on board is to say we have two indexes, one has exclusions, one doesn't. So you're absolutely right, it happened for things like controversial weapons and tobacco. Initially there were minimum exclusions for both, now they're purely focused on the PAB. So I would describe this political elegance that will probably lead to a wider acceptance in markets. Then we have the question from Stephen: is natural gas and electricity exclusions limits on a downward trajectory over time? I don't fully see the context. I think you're asking about the developments in the sectors. Faith, do you want to comment on the developments in natural gas and electricity from your side?
I'm not quite sure. I mean, we're certainly using not dissimilar analysis to kind of disaggregate some of the commitments made by the oil and gas industry in terms of some of their shifts in terms of their energy mix as they go forward, and using some of the analysis through TPI to kind of get to grips and unpick some of those commitments, because I think that's one of the challenges, particularly is actually knowing what companies are truly committing to, which is what we touched on that one earlier. Did you mean anything more broader than that?
I think that's good. I mean, Stephen, if you would maybe slightly rephrase the question for us. I mean, I would also like to highlight that the TPI data is available on the internet for everybody to look. It's extremely detailed, assesses exactly the relevant companies. You saw TPI levels presented by Virginia earlier for the oil and gas companies, and there's a lot more information on about 20 individual questions in the data set. So I think that provides the area, and I'm not fully sure how to interpret the question, Stephen, so if you could rephrase it for us, that'd be great. The next questions, and I will read them out as they occur here on the chat. So if you phase in Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions over the years, does this mean that you have to recalculate the benchmark portfolio also for the previous years? And if yes, how do you do that if you have no data available for the previous years at the time of phase-in? So the benchmark portfolio is the reference point indeed. We have provided, I believe it's Annex A in the handbook for climate transition investing, which provides the exact formulas. The handbook was launched on December 20th. You can find it on the Commission's website, or I can also post it. And generally speaking, the point here is that data has to be estimated, and it has to be estimated for Scope 3 for the companies, and that's inevitable. So the overall philosophical point of view is here, we're not going to wait for companies to disclose. We are estimating the data as a reference point. So you have two choices. I was showing Article 12A, which is for benchmark administrators or asset managers or asset owners that wish to estimate their own data. There is also Article 12B if the data is sourced from a vendor to look at that. The key thing in the estimation is that the precautionary principle is followed, because we know that this is an estimation, and because we know that this estimation in particular for financial services firms is going to be hard. We have given 4 years for that to be properly estimated, 2 years for some other sectors. For the sectors that are most urgently considered, they had to start directly, such as fossil fuel, but there's also better Scope 3 data already available for these sectors. Then we have a question The majority of climate change policies are focused on developed countries. If we fail to include the most polluting underdeveloped countries in the process, would it be possible to reach a combined goal to reach the carbon emission targets? That is a very good question. Mario Nava in his keynote pointed towards that we are having about 10% of the global emissions in Europe. Yet if we don't show people how it works to get to net zero, we can't inspire anyone else, I would say. And so also, of course, European investors can apply this criteria to investments around the world. And at that point, Facebook, what's your view on we are making the lead in Europe? How can we spill this over to other markets?
So was that a question to me, Andreas?
Yeah, yes, please. If you're happy to comment on that.
We're taking a lead in Europe. I think that's one of the reasons why I think so much of the outreach that we've all been working from these networks has been trying to be more global. Although not deliberately or set out to be a digital conference, the series Climate Transition Risk event that they ran a few weeks ago went digital, and therefore I was able to participate in that one, and that was doing a lot of outreach in North America, talking about very similar things, some of the commitments we've made and the steps that we've taken. And I think through TPI as well, we are sort of creating a network which is much more global in its nature, looking through New Zealand and Australia, as well as sort of America, and as well as the sort of European countries. So I think it's about continuing to share. There's also a programme of work being led by the PRI and the City of London in reaching out to Chinese asset owners that we're involved in. So I think a lot of we are very cognizant of the fact that we do need to have a solution that is sort of global, and we need to support each other as a global investing community. And I think the more people can do that outreach and share best practice and also learn about some of the barriers and approaches being taken elsewhere, then that's a way forward.
Faith, I'll follow up on this. TPI has been a great success for you. What were the things that most surprised you? Great success so far, I should say, obviously on the journey.
What has most surprised me? I think that I mean, I've been delighted by our hypothesis of what end investors needed to distill and to be able to rapidly compare and contrast what companies had done would suit their purposes. And we've got over 18 trillion of assets under management or assets under advisement using it now to support investment decision making, engagement, voting, those type of activities. Some of the surprising ones, I suppose, was the level of how useful the corporates found it. Obviously, they weren't the primary audience, but they found that the framework was in recognising what their investors wanted was a useful framework, and the level of engagement and responsiveness that we've had from the underlying corporates has been phenomenal. We get in the region of about a 70% response rate when we go out to check the data and to validate what we're saying, so which is incredibly high. The other was some of the ways in which the TPI is obviously not behind a paywall. There's nothing to stop anybody using it. I hadn't anticipated it being used by investment banks when doing due diligence on who they should take on as clients. I hadn't anticipated the Science Museum using it to vet potential sponsors and to part of their due diligence. So I think it's used in a whole host of ways, of which we're not even aware of all of them, but it's obviously empowering people to make more climate aware decisions in a whole host of ways, which is absolutely delightful. But primarily delighted and pleasantly surprised, I suppose, that we have been able to meet the needs of such a wide spectrum of investors.
That sounds absolutely fantastic. I wasn't aware that the Science Museum was using it. Stephen has followed up on the question. So he was asking essentially, I think this is related now to the Paris-aligned benchmark revenues. We are going to see percentage of revenues that some companies are making from, say, coal, oil, and gas, reducing to make it into the index. Yes, we would hope so. I mean, the coal percentage, Stephen, of more than 1% revenue, that's of course very tight So it's probably very hard to do that other than you basically divest coal as a corporate. But of course, going under the 50% revenue mark for natural gas is a manageable target, and maybe even under the 10% revenue mark for oil. We have a good number of questions coming in. I'll just most people don't specify which question is for whom face, but here's one that is specifically for you. What is your view on the activity of other UK pension funds in your sector with respect to moving the net zero agenda?
I think we're all on a journey. I think people are using some of the tools that we've got available. So we've obviously seen some commitments through the Asset Owner Alliance, through those networks. The LGPS pools are also sort of galvanizing their approaches around sort of climate and making those steps. So I think Brunel's approach is trying to push the boundaries, and it's very kind of quite holistic. We are being quite ambitious in trying to challenge on all 5 of those areas. I think some of my peers specialise in particular areas. Some of them have different models, depending on whether they invest in-house, and therefore the sort of the engagement and some of the capital allocation questions could be an area that they can take a lead on. But I think you're seeing there is a very strong momentum, I think, within investors across the UK and wider. And so I'm a glass half full person. So we are making progress on that front.
That's excellent to hear. I'll continue with the next questions here. We have a question: can you determine underreporters when Scope 3 emissions are estimated using emission factors considered most appropriately by the reporting company? ISO 14064 gives that flexibility to reporting organizations. So, of course, reporting organizations are very much allowed to follow ISO. We have reporting factors as a concern, not only in Scope 3, but also in Scope 2. For instance, when you compare market-based and location-based reporting, we have concerns simply with corporate integrity. So in essence, the numbers I was showing here is it's 21 of the firms on Scope 1 are reporting 100%. So one does have to work out from a Scope 1, then from a sector-based multiple. So determining underreporters is tricky, but anytime in statistics when you make estimations, you have a confidence interval, and the European Commission guidance very clearly recommends the precautionary principle, which is equivalent to the Rio 1992 Appendix 15, and that means don't look for the point estimate, look for the one at the upper boundary of the estimation. Then there is the common question, I guess, faces to both of us. Do we believe that the European Union is at risk of being a harder place to do business? Someone calls as always, are we becoming an industrial desert because of the green legislation? What's your view on that, with the European Union taking the lead?
I think it is quite complicated. I think that I suppose my broader view is that there has been such a demand for clarity around what does it mean to be green, for want of a very sort of crude definition, or how do we sort of reduce some of the levels of greenwashing. So I think what the EU has done is stepped in. The EU taxonomy, like anything where you try to define things, is a first step, and we'll learn by using it which bits worked, which bits don't, which means need a tweak. But I actually feel that there's been quite a lot of demand for exactly the work that the EU has produced, as I say, and I don't for any moment say that it's perfect. Apologies, Andreas, but it's a very healthy start, and as I say, we learn by using. I think the similar criticisms have been levelled at the United Kingdom before now with its corporate governance code and its stewardship code, which are far more demanding than its international peers now that they've been revised. But then the other way to look at it is, does being listed within these contexts, does this make you a stronger, more resilient company in the long term by being able to meet these standards? Does it actually put you in a more resilient position? at the end of the day, we do need to, we're on a net zero zone digital conference, because I think we all believe that unless we actually move down this direction, the economic consequences are going to be far worse. So yeah, I think it's that this is needed. I think some people will get challenged by the requirements, but I think those that are being challenged are probably those which I'd less likely to want to invest in the first place.
Yeah, I will also tackle the question from the question of what doing business means. We are most likely, all of us are at home now. Maybe we have some Swedish people that can take this from elsewhere, but the vast majority of us listening in now, and we still have 50 people on the line, will be at home. That is because the biggest risk, the biggest operational risk that ever happened, COVID-19, wasn't necessarily fully on the radar. Okay, COVID-19 can be a black swan, but there's other risks that are maybe more likely to see. And in fact, Bill Gates even warned of something like this in a TED talk. So the question is doing business just chasing opportunities, or is doing business chasing opportunities while protecting yourself or being protected by someone else of the biggest risks? And so when we in the European Union are chasing green opportunities, which we're clearly doing here, while we're protecting ourselves from making significant long-term misjudgments, which some other regions are doing, and you can see what happens to oil prices even going negative and maybe going negative again end of May, stranded assets are a compelling argument that there is a lot of balance sheet junk essentially in oil companies. I wouldn't think that makes us the worst place. I would think on the return risk balance that makes us a better place to do business, because you would have to assume that businessmen are always right, that they know every opportunity, and that they have godlike intelligence to say that they may not here and there need a couple of processes that helps them to think more long-term than they currently do. My personal view is that many business people are way too focused on efficiencies and way too less focused on effectiveness, meaning business people are focused on doing the things right and not enough focused on doing actually the right things. And because they're so over-focused on efficiencies to get returns 1 or 2% higher on an accounting report at the end of the year, they're forgetting to do the things that actually create value for the shareholders and stakeholders. And this is where the European Commission helps business people to consider effectiveness. Let's do effective business, because maybe not every business person is sufficiently focused on the long term and on the effectiveness. In fact, we have done an academic study looking at 2 types of executives. One type of executive is a share owner, as we call it. So that's someone that owns more than 5 years total compensation in shares. So that person has a much bigger exposure to the share price than to the annual pay. And then we have the other executive that is just a mercenary, essentially hired to do a job, not an annual pay. So, and you may not be surprised that the total downside risk for the share owner is significantly lower, and this is not only ESG downside risk, this is any downside risk, than the total downside risk for the actual mercenary. And so it is really a question, in my view, how executives are incentivized. If executives work in short-term incentives and do not own sufficient shares themselves, then they are more chasing short-term opportunities rather than looking at long-term effective strategies. And so in that sense, I think we're actually enhancing Europe's opportunities in the war for talent. We certainly make Europe one of the most attractive, maybe the most attractive economic zone to work into, given its structure. And so personally would be very positive on that question. We have another question here, and I think we have time for 2 or 3 more questions. So assuming the approach is a success, and hopefully it would be, is there a danger that investment is directed to firms doing well with the reporting against the taxonomy and away from firms addressing the social element of ESG? Similarly, when we look at global investment patterns, are we basically moving more are we basically moving more E than S is the question here. And at that point, I think Nadia is still on the line. So Maybe Nadia, do you want to take a first shot on the answer and Face and me follow afterwards? I'm not sure Nadia is, maybe she doesn't hear us. Face, what do you think? Are we moving more towards the E and less towards the S?
I think that there is a risk, and I think it's a very valid question and a challenge to the EU. I understand that, I've heard anecdotally that the S, or some thinking around that, although it is always trickier to sort of quantify that is something that is on that longer term agenda. I think as it happens, because of the crisis that we're currently in, that focus on the social issues is actually being thrown and is much more stronger now than perhaps it would have been if we just had the EU taxonomy in without this crisis. So actually some of that, the crisis might in itself sort of perhaps rebalance that. But I think the EU taxonomy will make it easier to quantify the E and for people therefore to be able to see that. So I think it's then incumbent on those of us in responsible investment leadership to then demonstrate some of the S metrics that you can get. I mean, we are increasingly seeing metrics on that side of things coming through gender pay gaps, diversity statistics, so other workforce disclosure. So there are opportunities there with disclosure frameworks to address that balance. But I think it's a good question that sometimes, as we say with a lot of these things, what gets measured gets managed. And if we're using the EU taxonomy to facilitate that, then perhaps there is a danger we take our eyes off the S. So I think it's for us to be really consciously aware not to let that happen just because we can't quantify it or in quite the same way. And I would actively encourage the EU to start a programme of work that starts to pick up those elements, because there's so much interaction between the E and the S, as we know. And obviously the commitments around things like the just transition bring that into particular focus.
I would also add to this just a political element from inside the Commission. So I personally think that both E and S are very important and in many ways equivalently important. When you have a look at greenwashing, it is much easier for organizations to greenwash because not everybody has sufficient natural science expertise and say an MSc in climate change, as for instance Virginia does, and it's quite difficult to follow all of that when you're coming like me from a business background. You really have to learn it over the years. So greenwashing is relatively easy because the normal consumer doesn't know enough about it. Social washing is much harder because pretending that something is good for society is quite hard to a society that understands this aspect better. So on the environmental side, it needs a bit more protection because the environment has lesser voice than society. And in addition, I think there's also the political aspect that to get all the member states to agree on an environmental target is relatively easy. To get all of them to agree on a social target when they all have different cultures and different social ambitions, and especially political parties are empowered with different social agendas, is a much harder aspect. So in many ways, a lot of the tech work is guidance, and asset owners interpret it in their own ways anyway. So for instance, everybody can make their own brown taxonomy. They don't necessarily have to use the brown taxonomy that's implicit in the Paris Line benchmark. And so I would very much encourage everybody to focus on the social things in parallel. I think Nadia is able to respond now.
Hey, Andreas, I don't know whether you can hear me. My microphone's not great.
I can hear you perfect.
Oh, brilliant. No, it was just because regarding your question on social factors, but I think you both answered it very well. I've just replied with my comments in line with yours, to be honest.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for coming in. Do we have any further questions at this stage? Are there any questions on LinkedIn? Okay, if there's no further questions, we have reached the end of our time pretty much anyway. I would like to very much thank all the speakers, Mario Nava, Ifigenia Parabelos, Jose Luis Blasco, Nadia Humphreys, Faith Ward. Thank you very much, and give them a loud applause. Maybe Kofi, can we unmute everybody so who wants can applaud?
Okay, don't be muted you.
So
thank you, Andreas.
Thank you very much. I would also like to thank the team of the Net Zero Zone who has organized this. So Christian Kofler, Brendan Mercedes, Shirin Crouch, and many others who have supported, pretty much the ones that Iphigenia has already named. And so in essence, we are very much intending to continue this. So please dial in. We'll probably do one about once a month to discuss everything on the net zero zone. It will be called net zero zone until there is a clear view what the net zero point is. So we hope we can change the name at some point. But at the moment it's a zone we are targeting another point. And please stay safe and sound. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope it was interesting, and do follow up on LinkedIn as you desire. Thank you very much, everybody.